Let me say a prayer for us, and then let's get started. We've got to try to catch us all up and get us on the same page here. So let's pray. Dear Father, what must it seem like from your perspective as you look down and see your children trying to figure out how to do a better job of shepherding? It must seem like you're watching kindergartners talk about physics. But we are amazed that you would trust us with the job of shepherding in your church, with our friends, with our neighbors. And so would you use this time for your purposes? And we acknowledge that it is you that would do any real healing of anybody. It is you that does any real care for people. It is only by your Spirit that people could actually be changed. You are our hope. And if you would bless our time tonight, because we're trying to stumble toward being faithful to that task. So be with us now. We pray in your Son's name, amen. Hey, a couple of quick announcement-y things. There's next week, because of July 4th, we're not going to have class. I mean, I'm not sure what not having class has to do with July 4th, other than the fact that I figured a lot of people may be out of town. Here, let me move this out of the way. Second thing is, you'll notice that we're not going to have class on July 21st. That was on the initial schedule. I'll give you a schedule if you didn't get one the first day. And the reason for that is I'm going to be at a Johnny and Friends camp with Skylar. And so if you're not familiar with Johnny and Friends, it's a group that works with special needs families. And so I work out this deal every year where I speak at their camp and Skylar gets to go free. So I think that's called being really cheap. And so it's one of the highlights of Skylar's year, and it's down at Fort Bluff. And so I'm going to be there instead of here on the 21st. But beyond that, the class is about to take, after tonight, the class will take a very practical turn. What we've tried to do in the first few weeks is kind of set some basic guidelines of what does it mean to shepherd? What does it mean to have good conversations? What does it mean to think the way Jesus does about conversations? Jesus thinks every moment is pregnant with the possibility of eternity. And if we are really believing in a sovereign God, then we should kind of have that way too, that maybe some conversations are just another conversation, but there's something about the way Jesus might deal with the woman at the well, or the person coming out, the mother coming out for the funeral of her son, where he runs into someone and he just sees that as a divine appointment that he takes to eternal issues. And so if we had that mindset, I think we'd live differently. I don't think that means you'd be super religious all the time. I don't think that means you would kind of scare people off with religious talk all the time, but I think you would always have an eye toward what is God up to that he has me talking with this person right now. And so we just started out with that idea, and started out with the idea that we ought to have better conversations, and we ought to be, and that kind of the simple way to say this is relationships are what gets you in trouble in this world. And God will use relationships with him and with others to get you out of trouble. Not as much a formula, not as much as a cookbook, but a relationship. If you think about, I don't think, I've been preaching for a long time, and very few people are going to remember my sermons. But people will remember the stories, and people will remember how they felt, whether they felt connected or not. Relationships have an incredible way of inviting transformation. We tend to think of the theologians in the room that are kind of working on their degrees. I'd love for you to not to think of most of us would think of kind of a behavioral theology, how should we behave? But I think God might actually want to expand that to a relational theology. How do we relate to others? At some level, you could define sin as any time you violate love to another person's life. When love is violated, that is sinful behavior, because that would be against what God would design. Now, don't misunderstand, loving somebody does not mean making them comfortable all the time. Jesus' teaching often disrupted and enticed. And so don't misunderstand. We have kind of a real, just a real soft kind of definition of love in our culture. And when I say you don't violate a relationship, to violate love would be, and that means I always have to be nice. No, it doesn't mean that you have to be nice. Sometimes the loving thing to do to me would be to say, Jim, put down that candy bar. That is a bad idea. That would be a loving thing. Now, I may not like that. I may throw the candy bar at you, but I'll probably eat it first. But so the idea of we're supposed to be curious about how then could we relate? How do we relate to other people? How could we connect with other people? And I talked a little bit about the theology of how do we take the ideas of science and psychology and the ideas of theology and how we put those things together. How do we put those together? And that there's different ways, different groups have done that. And I suggested that they're Christians. I mean, and you don't have to agree with me you don't have to agree with me to be following Christ, and you don't have to agree with me to be a good biblical Christian counselor. And some of what I teach comes out of my experience. Like even just putting this course together, I had to deal with Birmingham Theological Seminary, which I usually deal with Reformed Theological Seminary, and they're much more in the biblical counseling camp. And they really scrutinized the words on my syllabus. I sent them back and said, well, you can't use the word integration. That's okay. They scrutinize a little different because of their kind of where they might fit on that continuum. But they're good people. They love Jesus, and I don't need to, And so there are those of you in this room that kind of come from that biblical counseling camp, and I want to tell you, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad God uses you. God will continue to use you. I'm just suggesting that there is a clinical side that doesn't contradict a biblical side that you can integrate together that makes you really much more, that kind of gives you an additional area for discipleship. And if you remember, we then talked about the idea that the most problems are a combination of nature, nurture, choice. And I said that nature is the biological piece of it, and nurture is the things that have happened to you in your lives, the traumas. We know that trauma impacts the brain. We know that God did not design us initially for the kind of trauma of living in a fallen world. That's not how we were designed, and therefore the violation of that affects our brains. And then choice, the choices that we make, and that all those things. And the thing I like about that is that gives me a whole lot to work with in the area of discipleship. I also told you that I don't have a problem with us using words interchangeably, like coaching, discipleship, counseling, spiritual direction. I see all those as kind of the same sort of thing. I was talking with an elder this morning in between services who is in the process of doing all of those things with a man. Being very heroic in that person's life. But when he left the room, I didn't go, now, was that coaching he's doing? Is that counseling he's doing? Is that spiritual direction he's doing? I think he would say he was probably just helping in a crisis. But all those things I see as pretty similar stuff. Does that make sense? Be aware, a lot of people don't agree with that. A lot of people have very distinct categories. Say, no, coaching is only dealing with positive things, or spiritual direction is only talking about spiritual things. But I even have a hard time with that because I think everything's spiritual. I have a hard time slicing what is spiritual and what isn't. I mean, how I treat my neighbor is spiritual. And if I throw trash in his yard, you say, well, that's not spiritual, that's just social. You don't pick that up. No, I think there's a spiritual aspect to that. I think every moment has a possibility of sacredness. We then talked about all sorts of stuff. I talked about how to have better conversations. I gave you the anatomy of a conversation. And I find that to be very helpful for me. I think about that very often. Just this week, I had someone come into my office, not from our church, and they were talking about their spouse, and the whole time their spouse. So after about 35 minutes, I said, your spouse isn't here, and we can't fix somebody who's not in the room. So what's it like for you to feel like you're stuck in a marriage you can't fix? Now, what did I do? I went from external to internal, because we weren't going to fix anything externally. I mean, she or he wasn't in the room. So that's the anatomy of go to external, internal, and eternal. The third thing, then we talked about 3 types of conversations: competitive, informational, and connecting. The goal so often in the gospel is to connect with people. So those are those sort of things we talked about. And so I'm just trying to push all that into a bucket and say, okay. Then we talked about some of the assumptions that we could all agree with. We could all agree with some different assumptions, and I'm not going to go back through those, but just to say, one of those assumptions was maybe an assumption I didn't say, but I always get nervous of people who have formulas, and I always get nervous of people who say this is the way to do biblical counseling. This is the only way you can do biblical preaching. Whenever a human being tells me they know the only way to do something, I get a little nervous, because I see Jesus deal with people differently. I mean, if counselors were in charge of kind of writing the Gospels, there would have been the first argument about theology would have been, do you heal people by spitting or by touching? Because if you remember, Jesus healed the 2 blind people. One time he healed them by spitting in the mud, putting mud on him, and he washed that off and he was healed. The other time he just touched him. And I just have this kind of silly scenario in my mind, in my crazy imagination, that those 2 guys bumped into each other later on during Jesus' ministry, and they go, well, what group are you with? And I'm with the splitters. I'm with the spitters. And as well, we're right. That's the way you're supposed to heal. And the other one's going, well, no, I'm with the touchers, because that's how I was healed. And they fight about it and think the other one's wrong when Jesus happened to use both ways. And so I get a little nervous when somebody says, oh, I have the way to do counseling. If you said that, what we're going to do today, we're going to just say, okay, that's all we've got today. I'm going to give you a model for counseling. Is this the biblical model for counseling? No. Is this the only model for counseling? No. But it's a way that it's a way that I've kind of looked at this that's helped me to make sense. And I still use this. And so I'm going to send this around. Grab a sheet, and I'll explain it to you in just a second. While that's going around, let me just make a real quick announcement. You'll notice that we have a Saturday morning class on July 27th, and most of you are saying, well, you think you're going to be alone that day? I am. That's for the people that are taking this class for credit. However, I will allow, if you want to take it that morning, you can. Let me tell you what we're going to do that day. There's a test that I still use in counseling called Prepare Enrich. It's a premarital counseling. It started out as a premarital counseling tool. Then it became a counseling tool. Psychometrically, it's a pretty sophisticated test. It's a test for a man and a woman to take, and as the counselor, you'll get 25 pages of information back on that couple. And so it would take me 10 hours of asking questions to get 25 pages worth of information. I know about their family of origin. I know about their personality type. I know about how much agreement they have about money, about in-laws, about sexuality, about parenting, about forgiveness, about spirituality. I've got just sheets, 25 sheets of paper that I get from this Prepare Enrich test. And if you're interested in one, you don't have to be a psychologist or a counselor. You just have to be trained in the instrument. And I'm a facilitator for them, or I'm a trainer for them. And so back at RTS, every student who went through my counseling class had to be trained in the Prepare Enrich test. And I actually use it with I had a couple come in from out of town this week. I see pastors sometimes for intensives. And I wanted to get since I'm going to see them for about 12 hours in a block of 3 days, I'm going to see them for about 12 hours. And I've never met them before, and I'm probably not going to see them again. I wanted as much information as possible. And so I said, hey, I'd like you to take a quick test. And so before they came in, I had a sense of how much agreement they're in, whether or not whether they're fighting a lot or not. And it just is a helpful piece of data. People say, well, is it a biblical test? Well, a thermometer is not necessarily biblical, but it gives you great information. And so in the hands of somebody who knows Christ and somebody who knows the Word of God, it's a great tool. And I'm not a big personality test guy. I get really nervous when people, like right now, the Enneagram is a real big deal. And some people are into the Myers-Briggs, and some people are into the, whether you're an aardvark or a golden retriever or a hot dog or whatever you are, the different animals. And some people are the DISC. And if you've been involved in the military or Campus Crusade for Christ, you've taken 100 of those tests, and somebody stood up and made a fortune telling you about how you do. And I don't mind those things. They're helpful. They can give you some data. But I think they're also kind of silly, because an image bearer of God should not be reduced to one word or one code or one temperament. I think we're a little more complex than that. I mean, actually, because you actually reflect the very image of an eternal God. And so if you're interested in being trained in that test, we're going to do that on that Saturday morning. The kit to take that test, or the kit to be trained in that, is $70. If you are I'm not making any money on that. I send them $70. I'll even lose money on the postage back. I'll send them $70 for everybody who wants a copy of the kit, and they'll send me a copy of that. But if you want to take that, you need to tell me, because I have to pay for those things in advance so that they're here the day that we do the training. So if you're interested in being trained in the Prepare and Rich test, from that point on, you can give that test, and you'll kind of understand and how to use a marriage test with anybody. You get a free usage by doing it. You get a free usage, and it costs $35 to take the test. So really, you're really only getting, it's only cost you $35 to get trained in the test. I feel like I'm selling something. But and if you order before midnight, we'll send you absolutely free our greatest hits of the. So does that make sense? All right. So here's kind of new material. This is not. Let me kind of go through this with you. And does everybody fall into this? Of course not. Is this a way for me to kind of see the process of counseling? Is this helpful for me? It really is. And so I thought it might be helpful for you. Everything on this side of the line that says the life of the counselor happens before you do counseling, before somebody comes into your office, before you meet somebody. Just something to think about. And some of this we've actually talked about. It says God's purpose. You need to remember, God's purpose in counseling is not to solve problems. God's purpose in counseling is to use the problems to bring us to Him. God is not as concerned that I am free of all my anxiety as He would be that I am more dependent upon Him. God is not as concerned that I figured out a formula that my children would that if I did this, I guarantee they'd be okay, as He is that I would be dependent upon Him. God's purpose is kind of important. Second thing, presenting problem. You need to be aware that what you need to do is be curious about presenting problem. One of the problems with psychology as it's set up is that you have to do a treatment plan. If somebody's coming into my office as a professional, I have to write up a treatment plan. And that sounds really good. It's like, well, you should have a treatment plan. You should have a budget if you're going to go, if you're going to spend money. You should have a way to do that. The problem is the presenting problem is often not the real problem. The presenting problem is often something somebody sets on the table to see how you're going to deal with that. And so be aware that a lot of times people will give you part of the problem or a little of the problem just to see what you're going to do with it. And sometimes they might over-spiritualize the problem to see how you're going to deal with it. Sometimes they'll try to shock you. Sometimes they'll just give you a little piece of it But the presenting problem is really often not, I kind of see it more as an iceberg. Iceberg, most of it's under the water. And that even fits that even fits the proverb that says the heart is like deep waters, who can understand it? So when somebody comes into my office professionally, I'll write up a treatment plan because I have to. But my goal is that we'd get what's underneath just the behavior. Because what the treatment plan is supposed to be, why is this person coming in? They don't want to be anxious anymore. Or they don't want to be depressed anymore. Or they want to figure out parenting better. All of those are valid things. But since I believe God's going to use those things to bring them closer to God, I kind of sense of, all right, I see the presenting problem as a opportunity to look deeper at what the old Puritans, who very much are kind of Reformed faith, at least in America, has a lot of its roots. If you pull back, don't worry, this is not last week. I'm fine. Last week at that point, I was getting woozy. But the Puritans some of the writings of the Puritans are really rich in terms of, because a lot of the Reformed thinking was being rejected in Europe, and so a lot of the people that came to America early were kind of early Puritans who were essentially very Reformed in their thinking, and so a lot of their early writings has some real richness to it. But the old Puritans used to say, we need to look for the sin beneath the sin. And kind of what they meant by that was there's something holding up the things that we do. If they were real fancy theologians, they would have said, we're teleological beings. There is a reason that we do what we do. Let's be curious and figure out what that reason is. And so the presenting problem, which I always look at not as, I respect the presenting problem. If somebody comes in and says they're depressed, I'm going to find out about that. And we're going to talk about kind of a biblical way to think about depression very next week. Next time we get together, we'll be talking about depression. So I respect that. However, I'm going to always be curious for what might be to quote the Puritans, the sin beneath the sin. What's running underneath that? I don't come from the medical model that says if I cure the symptom, I've cured the heart. I think sometimes you can, if our kind of behavior is an iceberg and what's underneath it is our hearts. I used to be a classically trained artist. Sometimes if you just cut off the behavior, what'll happen to that iceberg? It'll just shift and another part will poke up. And it's amazing to me how often somebody, like when they first are dealing with an addiction, they'll go and they kind of white knuckle it. And it's like, I'm not drinking anymore. And they're not. And you go, great. And then you go, but why are they so obnoxious? And it's like, well, it's because we haven't dealt with the issues inside. We haven't dealt with their issues of their heart. And so the iceberg just reconfigures and a different part of it pops up. And so there's nothing wrong with white knuckling sometimes. I mean, if you came in here and said you're struggling with pornography, I'd want accountability. I'd want there to be things on your telephone and your computer. That's not good for you. However, if that's all we do, if somehow and you quit looking because we've made it so if you do, your brain falls out or something. We've not fixed your heart that felt inadequate and was going for pornography to solve what pornography can't solve. And so I'm always curious about that presenting problem. Does that make sense? So the next thing you need to think about before you do much counseling is what is the structure of man? How did God make us? And we could spend literally an entire graduate school course on kind of the structure of man. How did God make man? What does it mean? What does it mean? And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of some things to think about in terms of that. One of those I mentioned the very first day, which is that a human being is an odd balance of depravity and dignity. And so when you think about, when you think about the structure of a personality, people are much worse than you think they are and much more selfish than you think they are. And people have more dignity in them than you could possibly imagine. And both of those things are true. That's part of the way God made us. People are ambivalent about change. That's part of the personality. Some of those assumptions that I gave you when I said, hey, we can all agree with these assumptions, are some of my conclusions when I say, here's how God made man. And you just need to think about that a little bit. That's a theological construct. How did God make man? If I'm going to, and it's funny, I wouldn't take my car to get fixed by somebody who didn't understand basically an idea of how an engine works. I'd kind of, and there are guys that don't know much about an engine, but now know how to do computers. And you'll go into the place with your car and they'll plug it into the computer and the computer will give them a code and then they go and they fix that code. I actually, my son is very creative. My son Pierce is very creative, and he'll fix his car, but he knows nothing about engines or cars. What he does is he's a very good Googler, and so what he'll do is he'll find out this is broken. He probably doesn't understand that there's gas being shot into the piston, and the spark plug sparks that, and it makes the piston go. And when that piston goes, it makes he probably has no idea what any of that means. But he goes to Google, and he says you need to replace the widget wadger, and so he goes to the auto place and says, I need to buy a widget wadger for my truck. And he goes, he buys it. He looks on YouTube to see, they tell him how to put in a new widget wadger, and he does it. And it works for a while. Now, I would trust him. I wouldn't trust him to overhaul my engine because I don't think he really knows how engines work. I think he knows how to fix little pieces. And so a lot of counselors I know, both Christian and secular, have never stopped long enough to think about, okay, let me back up from problems. Let me back up from trying to fix depression or fix anxiety. Let me back up and see the design that God made in humanity. Do I understand how a human being works? Do I understand how relational we are? How frightened we are? How lonely we are? How much we're driven to belong? Do I understand the way that we are wired by God? Another way to say this one little section is, what does it mean to be an image bearer of God? What does it mean to be born in His image? What's it mean for humanity? And so, if you want to think about that, Larry Crabb wrote a book. There's bunches of books out there that I think try to speak to this. Richard Pratt's book, Design for Dignity, is a good book if you can find it. But what you'll find is there's not as many books on the structure of personality and how God made us as there are about how to fix depression. There's a whole lot more people out there doing Google work than doing that kind of structural work. And it's just helpful. And so, let me give you an example that will go completely against our culture. Gender. God made man and woman in His image. That's what the Bible says. Gender is pre-fall, meaning that masculinity and femininity were in creation before the fall. And everything before the fall, everything before sin entered in, is about the glory of God. So that means there's something about biblical masculinity that says something about the nature of God that biblical femininity can't and doesn't. And there's something about biblical femininity that says something about the nature of God that masculinity doesn't. That there is the reason that, and the reason we're complementary here, I don't know that people ever go back and think about why. And we end up fighting about what women can and can't do instead of looking at the beauty of the way God created. God, if you look at the creation story, there's night, light and dark. There's sea, and there's sea and land. And you look at all the way that he created in this complementary way. And the most beautiful places in creation are where those things come together. So the ocean, when you're on the beach, it's one of those beautiful places on earth because it's land and sea coming together. You know, and sunset and sundown is some of the most beautiful times because that's when light and dark are coming together. And there's something beautiful about the way God designed things that are similar but different to come together in an amazing way that reflects his glory. Now that's important to know. So what does masculinity say that femininity doesn't? I think there's something about, here's some big theological categories we'll solve with just a couple of broad strokes. Masculinity says something about the fact that God pursues us. Now, we're good Presbyterians, so God initiates all of it. But does God invite or does God pursue? Well, both, but he initiates it all. Well, how do you explain that? Is God knowable or is God mysterious? Well, he's both of those. How would you explain that? Is God holy and gracious? And now, I don't mean all women are this way and all men are this way, and it's a continuum, and there are some women that are further this way toward but in general, masculinity is going to say something about God's purpose, God's pursuit, about God can be counted on, God's protection. And that's why after the fall, one of the struggle of men is passivity. Because that's kind of the opposite of biblical masculinity. And femininity will say something about God, that God is beautiful and good and nurturing. And now, can a man be nurturing? Of course. Can a man be creative? Yeah. But in general, women tend to answer the question of God's goodness, beauty, and creativity, and femininity invites and masculinity pursues. And it seems to be, whenever people are in crisis, they tend to ask two questions. Is God good, and is God going to show up? And I think God tried to answer that with both masculinity and femininity. And now, can a woman not show up? Of course she can. And can a man not? Yeah, of course. But masculinity tends to answer the question, does God pursue? And femininity tends to answer the question, does God invite? And because sin, it gets all messed up. And so men become passive and women become controlling often. And instead of kind of trusting the way God has designed them. Now, you say, why is that? Why are you talking about that? Because that's part of how I see personality biblically. And so if I see a man in my office who is struggling with passivity, I know there's something in him that's dissatisfied because I know he's made for more. When I meet a man who doesn't have any strength to him, I don't get mad at him. I know there's something broken because I know that's how men are. I have creation on my side. When I meet a woman who's hard and weak instead of soft and strong, I know there's something broken there. Because women aren't supposed to be weak. I mean, what does it say in Proverbs? With strength and dignity, she laughs at the days to come. I mean, that's a sexy woman. I mean, that's a woman. But it's not a weak woman. But there's something, I would say the most simple way, and I know I'm going to give you two overly simplistic things to say about men and women. Biblical masculinity, I think, is supposed to be hard on the outside and soft on the inside. And you'll see literature from different cultures. It'll talk about the warrior poet and the singing cowboy, and you go, what? What's that? It's that kind of there's something about that knows that masculinity is supposed to have something that you can count on the outside and something soft and tender on the inside. And then there's something about femininity that is supposed to be soft on the outside, but rock hard strong on the inside. And so when sin enters in, we end up with hard women that are weak, or we end up with passive men that might be hard on the inside. Does that make sense? Because God's inviting something. So when I see that, when somebody comes into my office and they're not living out, I don't care if they bought into the craziness of our culture and they say that they're identifying as an alley cat. It doesn't matter. I know what the Bible says, and I can trust that I have creation on my side. And I know there's something in a masculine soul that wants to protect. I never taught that to Skylar, and Skylar is cognitively 7 years old. He has an IQ of around 70, 2 standard deviations below the mean. And he came home from a program he went to in Florida, and he said, "I'm never going back there again." I said, "Why not, Skylar? They like you there." And he goes, "They don't realize I'm a hero." I didn't teach him that. That there's something in his masculine soul that says, "I'm a hero." And then he got his Nerf gun and he started walking around our living room going, "I'm protecting us." And I'm going, where did that come from? Now, would a daughter ever do that? Of course. I'm not saying that, but there's a wiring that God made in us. Because masculinity and gender is not about genitalia or about biology or about sex or what you're attracted to. Gender is ultimately about how you reflect the glory of God. And that's why Satan is laughing at America today. Because we have taken what was supposed to be a way for us to understand a little bit more about God's amazing nature, and he's turned it into it's just some sort of... See, people under the age of 35 in this culture have been taught this phrase, that gender is a social construct. That's what they're taught. They've been taught that since the very beginning. It's like, it's a social construct. And so that's what they've been taught, and that is from the pit of hell. Gender is a theological concept. I mean, way before people were saying things like, I identify as a woman or a man or as in between. Way before people were saying things like that, there were centuries of cultures with masculine and feminine nouns and verbs. There's centuries of cultures where there's an archetype of masculinity and femininity way before, that's wired deeply in us in God's design. And so it's just important. And I just give 3 examples just quickly of some different categories when you think about, but if you're going to do a lot of counseling, you've got to do some thinking about, okay, not just problems and solutions. That's what a lot of counseling programs do, is they just kind of go straight to the, here's what you do for depression, here's what you do for anxiety. No, before you do that, you need to spend some time theologically going, okay, what does it mean for me to live as a redeemed child of God? How did God design me? How does the engine work? How does the heart work? What does it mean? Where does behavior come from? Where do feelings come from? How do they work with an image, as an image bearer of God? Now, if you were interested, we could spend, we're not going to, I've already got the class set, but if you said, hey, next summer, if you want to, let's do a class on that, we can do that. But it's important that you are aware. Let me quote scripture instead of my little brain. You are fearfully and wonderfully made by a master creator, by a God who you are fearfully and wonderfully made. There's beauty in you, and there's dignity in you, and there's femininity and masculinity and feelings and emotions and will and drive and That was all placed in you. And most of us go around every day just hating ourselves and thinking we're a mistake. And it's like, oh my goodness. So pull back. And if you're going to just do a little bit, I'm just want to have better conversations, that's great. But if you want to kind of say, hey, I want to do this a lot, then you and I need to sit down, or you need to sit with somebody and say, okay, let me think a little deeper about, I'm not just going to be fixing the engine. I want to figure out, what was the engine supposed to do to begin with? What were we made for in the garden? And what got damaged in the fall? Incredibly important questions. How did God design us, what we were made for? And what gets damaged because of sin? And sin messed up everything. And by the way, the curse, which is, if you know much, you all know the Bible well, but the curse is gender specific. Isn't that kind of interesting? So, all that to say, God's purpose, see the presenting problem as an introduction to deeper things, and spend some time wrestling with structure of personality. Then you'll see next on this, there's this big line that says the life of the counselor. And this is where some people really would disagree with me, but I think it's, I think it may be one of the most important things we say today. I think you can fool people from the pulpit. I know a lot of people that fool people from the pulpit. I've given sermons when I wasn't doing very well. And I prayed that God would, I consider preaching an incredible task. And I pray that I know what this says about false teaching in the Bible and the warnings, and I'm very commonly praying, Lord, don't let me be a false teacher. Make sure when I look over the scripture, is this really what it says? I don't want to be cavalier with the Word of God ever. But have I ever gotten up and preached beyond where I was? Yep. This morning, my Sunday school class. Is anybody in my Sunday school class this morning? Oh. My hypocrite meter was like redlining because we were talking about how to be more like Jesus. If we're supposed to be the disciplines of Jesus. And I'm glad Mona wasn't there this morning, because she would have just stood up and said, because I was talking about the fact that if you want to be more like Jesus, you need to be a little less task-oriented, a little more relationship-oriented, and you need to slow down. And you need to be present with people. And I thought, I'm almost never present with people. I'm always in problem-solving mode. I'm always way out here. And when you read Jesus in the Gospels and you see this amazing walking along people and just paying attention to them in the present, and he's not trying to solve their problems. He's trying to be present with them. And I'm going, oh my goodness, Lord. And so I had to teach a Sunday school class on slowing down to be more like Jesus. To sometimes put tasks away and be more concerned with relationships. I thought, oh my goodness, let me put my list down of all the things I have to accomplish today. Don't get in the way of my list. But Jesus let people get in the way of his list every day. It's almost like, I always love it when a business person tries to look at Jesus and say, follow the Jesus model of, follow the Jesus model of business management. And I go, so you're just supposed to wander around and love people that you bump into? That's the model that we're, that, and I'm not saying that, I'm just saying that I'm not, to run a business, you have to have goals and all those things, and that's fine. To get through seminary, you have to have goals and all those sort of things, and that's fine. But to be more like Jesus, you have to be able to see the people in front of you, not just the tasks ahead. And so my hypocrite meter went off. And so as a teacher, you can fool people. But I think as a counselor, it's really hard to fool people. I think people kind of know, because I don't think you'll go to their hard places if you haven't gone to your hard places. I think there's a reason that Jesus said this. And it's that, and I'm going to put my language on it. Before you do the delicate surgery in somebody else's eye, before you do in the most complex organ of the body, other than maybe the brain, the eye, before you start poking at somebody else's. And before you do the delicate work in somebody else's eye, make sure you've taken everything out of your own. And that doesn't mean you have to be perfect to be a counselor, but it does mean it is very, very difficult to take people further than you've gone. And so if you're struggling with addictions inside that you never talk about with anybody, and somebody's coming to you and they're talking about some of their behaviors that they can't control, it's going to be hard for you to look for deeper things. You're going to just kind of settle for less. And so the life of the counselor, I think, is crucial in being a good counselor. There are counseling models that will be taught to you every day, and they have a lot to offer you, and I'm just, that basically say, hey, it doesn't matter who the counselor is. It just matters that you give truth, and that therefore counselors could be interchangeable. So Joe Schmo goes to see me about something, and then I can't meet with you anymore. I'm going to bring in, Chuck Wagon, and Chuck Wagon's going to meet with you, and he's going to talk with you. And there's people with some biblical models and some secular models that would say that's no big deal, because the issue is not the counselor. The issue is not the relationship of the counselor with the client. The issue is truth. And the bridge truth walks on is that relationship. And therefore, counseling looks different for different people. And that's why it's important that you've looked at your own life. That's why as a pastor, if I were in charge of pastoral training, and now you're wondering why I don't work at RTS anymore, I would have required all the pastoral students to go to counseling. We required all our counseling students to go to counseling. I remember one guy came in at the beginning of the program and says, well, I don't know what I'm going to talk to him about. And I said, well, perfect people don't have anything to talk about, but the rest of us have lots to talk about. So for you to get a degree in counseling, you have to go to counseling at least every other week for the next 2 years. And then they'd come back. It's really kind of funny. At the end of the 2 years, they'd go, I'm going to just keep meeting with my counselor after I leave. And I go, well, that's because they realized Jesus was serious when he says, there's a log in your eye, buddy. And if you're going to have the audacity to do surgery in somebody else's eye, the delicate surgery of taking out a splinter in somebody else's eye, you had better taken care of the log in your own. And so I consider the life of the counselor crucial in counseling. It may be, if I were in charge of the world in a good, that's like, if that ever happened, go ahead and move. That's kind of the most important thing I would say that a counseling student should do, or a pastor even. Have they looked at their own life? Are they preaching from a stance of what's inside of them? They don't have to be perfect. Of course, you either have to be perfect or repentant, and since none of us are perfect, you have to at least be repentant. But are they preaching from a place of their own growth, or are they just kind of dialing it in and just telling, showing pictures of somebody else's vacation from, the Grand Canyon? This is where my friends went to Grand Canyon, and this is what they saw, as opposed to, here's what's going on in my life. Here's what I've done with Christ. And so I really believe the most important thing you can do to become a better preacher, to become a better friend, to become a better counselor, is look at look at your own life, look at the story God is telling with your life. And really, this is very important. You don't go to counseling or pastoral care for the sake of self. That is a waste of your time. And I know people who kind of go to counseling. It's like, I just know myself so much better, but they're still jerks, and you think, well, I'm glad you know yourself, but you know what? No one else wants to know you. The reason you look at your life is not for the sake of self. That would be a waste of your time. The reason you look at yourself is so that you can see how you don't love others well, and how your story has gotten in the way, and the hurts of your life and the traumas of your life and the defensivenesses of your life have gotten in the way of you loving other people the way God wants you to love them for the sake of his purposes. I've spent most of my life just justifying what I do. It's like, and that's I had a really brilliant person say something to me about, hey, there's another way to tell your story, and that's as a lawyer trying to justify himself. And I thought, well, I do that sometimes. And And I think God would invite us to have a little more humility, that would look at our lives and live differently. Again, you don't look at your life for the sake of self. You look at your life for the sake of, so I can do the delicate surgery God's called me to do in people's lives. Because there's people hurting all around you. I mean, we are literally living on the front lines of spiritual war. And there are people bleeding out all around you. We just don't know it. There's people in our own church that are bleeding out. There's families that are falling apart. There's things going on. And God's called us to kind of pay attention to that. But if you're not looking at that stuff in your own life, you're not going to be able to have the eyes to see that with. And whatever you've experienced becomes the only way to do things. I love a recovering alcoholic because they have faced a brokenness. But one of the things that's kind of funny about them is that if they got sober through however they got sober, they think that's how everybody's got to get sober. And so some of the most angry people I know are went through AA and they come and I say, well, let's talk about this. They go, well, have you got AA? And I go, well, let's, and it's because that's the only way they think people can get better. But I regress. The life of the counselor is important. And how have you looked at that log in your own eye? Does that make sense? All right. It is, we started at 6:30. It's now 7:30. We're going to go till 8, and then the people who want credit are going to go 30 more minutes. Does that make sense? How exciting is this? All right. All of what I just said is what you should be thinking about. You say, as a Christian, you say, I think I've got to gift. People tell me stuff, or I'm going to be a pastor, and therefore people are going to tell me stuff, or I just have this gift. So those were kind of the precursors. Before you start doing a lot of this sort of work, I want you to keep God's purpose in mind, see the presenting problem as a beginning spot, not an ending spot. Do some deep work about how God made us, and look at your own life, and look at your story that God's telling. And now somebody comes into your office. Somebody sits with you at Starbucks. Somebody's over at your house. You just watched the Tennessee Vols win the national championship, and you're just hanging out. And most people, when you first meet them, they live as a reactor, meaning they don't know they don't know. I don't know why I do what I do. So they're kind of an angry person, but they don't know why they're angry, or they're hard, and they don't know why they're hard. That's just my person. That's just me. That's just me. That's just the way I am. I'm just kind of anxious. I'm just an anxious person. They live their life as a reactor. It's like they haven't thought a lot about it. And that's how most of us, and there are a lot of people who live their whole life, and that's where they stay. I've got a member of my extended family who loves me and knows what I do for a living, and he just, or she, they're just going to live, and they're good people. They love Jesus, but they're going to live about an inch deep and 10 miles wide, and until the world blows up, until the wheels fall off the car. That's just how they're going to live, and they're going to live as a reactor. And I just pray that they'll make it. They love Jesus. They're going to make it to heaven. It'll be okay. But I've seen them a couple times, and the wheels are wobbling. And I'm thinking, maybe there's some things you can think about. Maybe God wants you to learn some things here. But it's like, no, the wheels are just wobbling, but they're making it. I think, okay, I don't have this goal to just make life harder for people. Especially people when they get toward my age, I was seeing somebody not that long ago and it would have been nice if 20 years earlier they'd had faced the fact that they'd lived their whole life preoccupied with themselves. But at their age, it probably was okay just to let them figure out how do we just kind of rearrange things so that you can just stumble into heaven and be okay. But I'd love to have met him 30 years earlier and said, you can have a whole different way of seeing life. So, God's gracious. God doesn't make us face everything we have to face at one time. Matter of fact, it's part of God's grace to us. It's part of what theologians call common grace. If you had to experience the pain, of every person in this room right this moment, you can get out the door. If you just had to experience the pain of everybody within a mile circle of this spot, I mean, you'd just crumble. And it's by God's grace that you don't have to hold all that. It's by God's grace that it's not up to you. It's by God's grace that He allows you to engage with other people, but you don't have to contain that. That's His grace to us. And so sometimes by God's grace, He doesn't make people face this stuff. I mean, it's really supposed to be a survival technique for children. You'll hear about it. Sometimes you'll hear, have you ever heard of somebody say they have a dissociative disorder? Have you ever heard that? It's kind of a fancy psychological word, which means, what it means is that they kind of pull away from the situation and they're kind of living life like they're on the first row watching a movie of themselves. It kind of feels surreal as they live their lives. Now, we've all experienced that. Like if you had the funeral of somebody you love, there's a part of you that kind of feels numb, or if you just had a car accident and you're and you're physically okay, but you're just, that God has given our brains a way to kind of dissociate and pull away. And that's God's gift to you, so that you don't have. There's only so much pain a human heart can handle. And a lot of children who have significant trauma, the way that they survive sexual abuse as a 5-year-old, there's no category for that. There's no file folder in a 5-year-old's brain for sexual abuse, and so they dissociate. They're not present. I had a woman who came to see me for counseling who was she'd become a Christian. She was no longer. She sold friendship for a living before she became a Christian. She was a woman of the streets, if you will, before she became a Christian. And I remember saying to her, because I knew that God made her for dignity, not for depravity, and I said, so how did you put up with being such an object to others? And she said, I would just shut my eyes and pretend I was in a doctor's office. Now, what she was saying was I would dissociate. I would pull away. And so God gives us those. You can't handle all the pain that there is in a fallen world. Only God can. And so there are people that God will just let stay as a reactor their whole life. And I'm not going to go chase them down and say, live deeper. They do. But often that doesn't work, because God wants us to become more dependent on Him and to live more present and more fully. He came to give us an abundant life, not a distracted pretend life. And so when people come, often it's their problems that bring them in when they're in the reactor stage. And so that first stage is I'm a reactor. And so, and in that stage, people just talk about what's going on in their lives. Now remember, I said if people stay there, we're not going to change them. And we're not going to change them anyway. God's not going to change them, because there's something dynamic that's going to be taking place. And so I'm going to try to make a shift from stage 1 to stage 2. And stage 2 is what I call the sinned against sinner stage. I don't like the word victim, because victim would imply our culture is on a race to victimization. Our culture today says everybody's either an oppressor or a victim. And that's a dangerous way to see the world. The Bible would teach that we're sinned against sinners, that I have been victimized by my world and I victimize others. And so that first stage, I want to help people see their deep longings and see their deep hurts and their deep disappointments. That doesn't sound very fun. When the pastors come in to see me for intensives, they have a form they fill out, and one of the things says, tell me the 10 times you felt most alive in your life and the 10 times you felt most dead in your life. Because I want to try to get to see what, and I'm going to look at that category of the things that they felt most disappointed in, most dead in, and I'm going to follow that down this trail, because I want to move them from a reactor to a place where they kind of see themselves as someone who's been harmed and broken by this fallen world. Now, biblically, I don't want people to stay at victim. God doesn't want people to stay at victim, because ultimately you're not a victim, because you don't have to repent of being sexually abused. You have to repent of becoming a hard person who doesn't love others. But until you see the reason I became somebody who doesn't love and protect myself others is because I was abused, and so therefore I protected myself. And until you understand that dynamic, you can say all day, you need to let people better. You need to be nicer to people. You need to let people in. And they go, I'm trying to, but I don't. And so that first stage is going to be from reactor to sinned against sinner. And they begin to go, oh yeah, now it makes sense that I don't trust men. Oh, now it makes sense that I get nervous with authority because of the way authority treated me. Now it makes sense. Now, you don't want to stay there. I don't want someone to stay there, because ultimately what I want someone to see is sees the damage. You're not crazy. There's a reason you do it what you do. However, that doesn't give you an excuse to not be able to love. Now I'm moving towards something they can repent of. They don't need to repent of being abused. They need to be loved that they've been. They need to be treated with dignity that they weren't given. They need to be understood. But once they understand that you were made for a father that would treat you different than that, then the invitation to say, boy, I've said this phrase 1,000 times in counseling, but I hate it when the bad guys win twice. What do you mean by that? I said, well, the bad guys won once when you were abused. But when now you live out of a place of fear, the bad guys keep winning. And I look forward to the day that you trust God enough to not give those bad people power anymore. And that's the beginning of moving them from reactor to sinned against sinner to an agent. Does that make sense? An agent is someone who has responsibility. And it's funny. Again, be real careful what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that somebody who has an abusive background, because I know physiologically their brains have been changed. I mean, I know physiologically their brains, there's a physiological reality to trauma. And I know they've been changed. So I don't go, well, okay, tough luck. So this happened to you. Pull yourself up your bootstraps, big boy. Put on your big boy pants and let's get on with loving people. No, that's not going to help. I want them to understand that what they did, really, what was happened to them really did damage them. But it doesn't have to damage them forever. That sorrow, struggle, trauma has a shelf life. And biblically, and the truth is, secular counseling, this is all they really do. It goes from you were a reactor, understand how you were victimized. And that's maybe 60% of it. You'll live with much more freedom. You'll be able to feel more choice if you do that. But you don't heal doing that. You heal when you begin to say, I'm going to take my abusive father off his throne, and he doesn't get to determine the way I parent. He doesn't get to determine the way that I live next. There is hope and freedom because God's telling a different story and it's in this moment that people realize they're in a story war between the story that was their victim story and a story of glory. And that's a powerful place for people to be. A lot of times people don't feel choice until they understand this. Until they kind of go through the desert. And the people who kind of go from stage 1 to stage 3 often can get pretty legalistic because they solved the behavioral problem, but they'll rarely become dependent child of God because they didn't go to the despair and the brokenness. They just went from, I'm not going to do that anymore. And so So there's a danger in this model to stay in stage one. You just become a reactor your whole life. There's a danger of getting stuck in stage two, where you're a victim and you spend your whole life, well, I'm just a victim. I get nervous when somebody 20 or 30 years after they started counseling, they're still going to counseling but they still consider themselves primarily a victim, as I don't think that's how God sees them. And there's a point where somebody, when they've been sexually abused, that they really initially kind of get into that a lot, and maybe lead groups on women who've been sexually abused or men who've gone through, that would be very common at first. But if 10 years from now that's the most important thing in their life, then I think they've gotten stuck in the victim place. Because God would want to move us on. Then we'll always be tender to that. I'll always be, because that's where God brought me from. But if that's all I talk about, I get nervous, because that means they kind of got stuck there. So there's a danger of staying down in stage two. There's a danger of skipping stage two and going straight to stage three from stage one, and that person will become kind of legalistic, and they'll think, just try harder, and I did it. And my guess is that's not going to be, they're not going to be transformed. They'll just get some behavior change, because God wants to change the heart. So stage three is independent agent. That's where the person begins to realize that, wait a minute, I've got a choice here. I don't have to let the bad guys win here. And again, I don't expect you to remember my sermons. I don't remember them either. But if you do remember, a couple of weeks ago, I did one where I said that there was an ace card we play. The Satan, I tell you what, I'm going to say that, and if everybody would just nod your head like, of course we remember every word you say. Hey, y'all remember that sermon I gave where I said there was an ace card that Satan plays? Oh yeah, you remember it. You could quote that to me. Truth is, none of you remember it, and that's okay. What I was really talking about is I wasn't using this kind of language. But I was saying is that Satan knows your story, and he knows how to attack you. And he doesn't want you to move to the agent stage, because he wants you to stay at, well, here's what you've done. Here's what you've done. Here's the mistakes you've made. And he plays that ace card on us. And that's really what I was talking about. I didn't use this language, but when I was given that sermon, I was really talking about the idea that part of spiritual growth is the ability to tell Satan, I literally mean this, go to hell. You don't play that ace card on me. Because bad guys don't get to win twice in the story of glory. And that's, I'm so glad you're here, because you're going to preach. You don't have to apologize. You don't have to apologize. What I would do to have 20 of you with your heart here going, yes, preach it, because that's a sermon in there. So anyway, stage three is independent agent. Does that make sense? And so now on this side of heaven, once you become kind of an independent agent, you realize that you have choices, you can make different decisions, there's things that are going better in your life. Is everything perfect? No. And you get to a place where you go, oh, Lord, even though you've changed me, the shiny is off in this world. Oh, how I need you. And that's that last stage, dependent. And in some ways, you'll go through this once in your life. In some ways, you'll go through this 100 times a day. Let me just give you a silly example. Often, I wake up early in the morning when it's still kind of dark and get dressed and try not to make anything. And it's pretty usual that my socks don't match. Because when it's dark, a brown and a black sock look about the same. And so I get to work, and people pay money sometimes to see me, and I look down, and there's a brown and a blue sock, and they never match. These don't match either. And I go, and I'm a reactor. It's like, I can't believe it. All I want in life is a pair of socks that match. Is that too much to ask? And so what sometimes has happened in our home, to tell you the truth, you think I'm kidding. one point, I just went on Amazon and bought 60 a gross of the cheapest black socks I could get. And I said, and we're throwing away everything else, and that way, no matter what, they'll match. I mean, it was just like, so we just dump them in, and I pull out 2 socks, they'll match. I realize you are better people than me. I will sometimes.
My husband are twins. He does the same thing.
So here's what'll sometimes happen. We're going through the. I get, I get out where I'm getting breakfast. I look at my socks don't match. I can't believe my socks don't match. I can't believe we live in a house where we can't get our socks to match. I mean, how hard is it in this world to just match our socks? It's only 2 colors. And I'll wake Mona up, and I'll just be nasty, and I'll just go, I can't believe it. I have a PhD, and I should be able to live in a house where socks match. Now, at that point, what am I? Other than a jerk, I'm a reactor. I don't know why I do what I do. And then I start thinking, and I say things like, is it too much to ask? I work really hard, and I mean, life's kind of tough. I'm getting up early. I'm trying not to wake anybody up. I can't believe that nobody cares enough to make sure my socks match. Come on, what's the problem here? And at that point, I'm a victim, right? And then I look at the life my wife lives and see how difficult it is to deal with Skylar every day, and how much she does so much heavy lifting compared to me, and she's a better person than I'll ever be. And I kind of go, I'm sorry, I can't. Maybe I'll just buy a gross of socks from Amazon, and we won't have this fight again. I'm sorry, I don't want to be a reactor. I don't want to be a victim, and some of this is my own fault. I mean, how's it Mona's responsibility to make my socks match? I mean, it's not like we're in the 3rd grade and she has to match my socks. I mean, that's my job. That's not her job. And I kind of become an agent, and I go, okay, I'll do that. And then, so things go a little bit better. I'm making choices. I'm no longer, and then one day I get here and I look and my socks are around, like, I can't believe it. I just need God. And so so in some ways, obviously a silly example, but in some ways you'll go through this process of, I'm a reactor, I'm a victim, I'm an agent. Oh, how I need you, God, over and over again in your life. And that's really kind of the process that I think God wants us to take us through with our problems. We have our problems. Where are they coming from? Well, what do they mean? What's going on inside your heart? Let's explore the heart. Let's explore what's happening. Let's explore that where it comes from. And you kind of move to that I'm a sin against sinner place. And then it's like, yeah, but look, what have I done? How have I contributed to that? Oh, God, forgive me. And then, God, give me the power to change the way I think and do things. And then you move to that place, and then there's a place where he goes, okay, now that you've done that, life still doesn't completely work on this side of heaven. You still need me, and you're a dependent child of God. And that's kind of now, is that the biblical way to do counseling? No. It is a helpful way that I keep in mind when I'm sitting with people. And so it helps me because I think, where is that person in this journey? Are they living as a victim? And then that tells me maybe I need to help them move up to agent. If they're living as a reactor, which is how most people come to you and how most people will be at first, how do I help them get down to seeing the things that are broken inside of them? And so you can burn this if you want. This is not the biblical way to do counseling. I have found this to be a helpful model for me to kind of walk through people with, because there's sometimes you think, where are people? Where is this person? And by this, I've got at least four stages and 3 shifts that I know that I can kind of see where people are, and it's just really a helpful way for me to think about counseling. Does that make sense? Now, Chuck DeGroat's written an excellent book called Out of Exodus, which is using the story of Exodus to be the model of counseling. And he takes the story of the people that were in slavery and how God uses that story. Historically, it's true, but it's also metaphorically true. And he does a good job of talking about the counseling process and using that story. I actually helped write a book with a guy by the name of Andrew Bauman, Nav Press book that had to do with taking the story of the prodigal son and using that as a way to see the process of counseling. So there's lots of different ways to think about the counseling process. And over the years, I've heard all sorts of ways to think about it. And this is just personally for me, a helpful model for me to keep in mind when I do counseling, because it helps me see the different places people can be in the journey. And repentance usually is the place in the shift two. If you come from a biblical model, you'll hear, well, where's the repentance? And that's going to be in shift two. But I want to make sure that the repenting of not the surface, but of what's underneath the surface. Not just the behavior, but the relational violations. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about that?
As complex beings, I'm just wondering how often somebody might be in different stages at the same time dealing with, maybe they've been victimized and they're in the victim stage, but they're overcoming something else, and so they're in myriad of spots.
Yeah, that is such a good question. I think almost every issue in your life could go through this. And so you might be a dependent child of God when it comes to maybe some parts of your life that you really haven't even started working on the reactor part in another. And so, and people are not, remember, most of us want a counseling model that helps people get from point A to point B. And I think sometimes God might want you to stay at A for a long time and just trust him. I'm not sure that God always buys into that's the goal. I think he would say the goal is trusting him all along the way. We had a counselor at RTS named Roger Shepard, good guy, one of the smartest guys I ever met. And this is what he would, when he started supervision, here's what he'd say. He'd say, okay, here's my counseling model. People are here, and they're wanting to get here. And all the students are starting to write down A, B. And he goes, and this is how the process goes. Any questions? And it's like, well, thanks, Roger. But I mean, but that's really what you're asking. You're saying people are such a mess. I mean, we've got all sorts of stuff going on inside of us. And we're impacted by our culture. We're impacted by our history. We're impacted by the people in our relationships. And so it gets kind of convoluted. And this helps me pick one area and kind of see how we're doing. And then you may pick another area and see how you're doing. And then also, in a way, in general, how are you doing in life? And so Roger Shepard would be absolutely impressed that I remembered that that's what he did every year and that I showed that to you all. So so that's the model of counseling. So how does the rest of this semester go? Now that we've kind of said, we're in this task together of caring for people, what are going to be the most common presenting problems that will come through the door? Or be at Starbucks with us, or be at the pizza place with us, or be wherever we are. And we're going to just kind of walk down that road. And so the first one will be depression. And when we talk about depression, the week after July 4th, we'll look at things like suicide, and we'll look at what do you do when somebody's suicidal, and we'll talk about what causes depression. We'll talk about the biology of depression. We'll talk about the spirituality of depression and where that comes from, and what you might want to think about, or what are the sort of questions you can ask to move people down that path toward dependent child of God when someone has depression. We'll take a week off. I'll be in Johnny and Friends. You guys will just be hanging out. The following week, we'll talk about anxiety. And if you just come to 2 classes the rest of the time, anxiety and depression would probably be the 2 I'd recommend, because anxiety is the common cold in America today. And this isn't going to be a cookbook on how to solve those things, but it'll be ways what are the sort of questions I can ask that would move people along the path toward healing if what I see when they walk in the door is depression, or if what I see if I walk in the door is anxiety, or if what I see in the door is addictions and all those things. So that's how the class is going to go from now on. Remember, you are well. I do need to hear from you if you want training in the prepare and enrich material. If you want to be certified to give that test, I need to hear from you. And if you send me a note saying I want to be trained in that thing, I'm spending $70 for you to get trained, and you owe that. So, because Todd Colbush is our financial guy here, and he will not let me get away with anything. So I'm just saying. So if you want, and you don't have to be taking the counseling class from the seminary in order to take that test, to be trained in that test. It's just a fascinating test. The pastor and his wife that came in this weekend and took it, and we used that to kind of set our categories, what we were going to talk about the rest of the time they were here. His last question to me was, can I get the people in my church, the pastors, trained in this test? I said, well, sure. I'm a facilitator. I can train you people to do that. And he goes, I want this. This was so helpful for us as a couple because there's so much to deal with, and it gives you categories to say, okay, here's what. And I literally said, each one of these is a book on the shelf. Which books do you want to pull off the shelf while we're together in the next few days? And it was like, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this. I want us to work with this. And then you begin, and it helps you with the complexity of a person. So if you want that training, you will forever have a code, and you can go on their website and put in your code, and you can purchase and sign people up to take the test and then give the test to people. Does that make sense? So if you think you're going to have a ministry with young couples especially, it's a great thing to do, to get trained in. If you're a couple, I'd just take one of you to take it and just get a number for one of you and do it together. But you got to let me know, because I've got to order the kits. If you are taking the class for credit, we're going to take a quick break and let everybody leave who's not. And there'll just be 5 or 6 of us probably, and we won't stay a long time, but I want to just talk about the class itself for credit. The main thing I'd love to ask you to do this week is in the, here's a copy of the syllabus just in case you don't have to get it. I got another one right here. Something that, when it looks at literature that you're supposed to look at before the class, which of course we couldn't have done, but there's an article that's by Dan Allender called "What's Wrong with Us?" I'd love for you to read that article this week. You're going to hear some of the things that I've said today, like sin is a violation of love. You'll hear that in his article. Pretty interesting. It's a pretty interesting article. And he's a pretty easy read. I mean, so read that this week. When you look through the required text, I want you to pick 3 books. You don't have to read all 8 of those books. I'm going to suggest a couple that I would. The book 3, The Elements of Counseling. That's really not a book you would read. That's kind of a cheat sheet for psychology. It's really a secular textbook. That's kind of, they don't use this term anymore, but when I was in school years ago, they used to have things called Cliff Notes. And Cliff Notes were, you didn't read the book, but you read the Cliff Notes, and that would, now I think you just get online and it's all on there. But this is kind of Cliff Notes for American psychology. So since you're going to be dealing as a pastor in this culture that is very psychologically sophisticated, it's not a bad book to have on your shelf. It's going to talk about what are the different theories of counseling that are out there secular-wise. What are the now? But you don't have to read that whole book. I mean, but it wouldn't be a bad reference book for your library. It's not that big, and you can get a used copy probably for almost nothing. So that's not a book I'd want you to. So out of the 8 books, that's a book that I would encourage you to buy, but don't see that as one of the 4 I want you to read. I'd love for you to. I like To Be Told by Dan Allender. I like Understanding People by Larry Crabb a lot. Instrument in a Redeemer's Hand by Tripp is very good. And I mean, if I were just ranking them based on which I would think would be the best to read, would be To Be Told, Understanding People, Instruments in a Redeemer's Hand, and probably Emotionally Healthy Discipleship would be my top. But I don't want you to miss the other options. 4 is really not a book to read. Tim Keller wrote remember I talked about 5 models of counseling on that chart? It's not that Tim Keller wasn't smart enough to have 5, he just has 4. But it is someone talking about some of the same ideas of how are the different ways people talk about counseling. And it's worth a read, but it's a real easy read. It's just an article. So I would just, as time goes on, I'd love for you just to read those. What we'll probably do is we'll spend some time talking about, I'll ask, so what books are you reading? And we'll talk about that. So if you read something you guys don't, you can learn from him. And we'll just kind of talk through those sort of things. Let me talk about seminary reading. You all are good Christian men. And when I say something to you like, did you read all the material? You are good Christians. And so you think, well, I did skim over a couple of those that were, when he kind of got one paragraph that seemed like it was repeating himself. And then there was a night I fell asleep and I technically read page 7, but I don't remember anything on it. So I've got to say I only read 50%. Seminary reading is not word for word reading. Seminary reading is have you honestly looked at the text? Have you tried to learn from it? Have you tried to gather from it? I would recommend that when you read every seminary text is that you read the beginning of the chapter to see what they're saying the problems are, the issues are. Read the end of the chapter to see where he's going, and then pick up inside as you need. In most seminary classes, you're going to have 300 or 400 pages. There was a professor at RTS that probably had 300 or 400 pages a week for students to read, and then he would ask them to pledge their reading. And I thought, I know those guys, and I know no one read all 500 pages and did everything else they had to do for all the other classes. Anyway, so I'm kind of giving you permission I want you to take the right reading seriously, but not worry about it. One thing, what I want you to do is I do want you in the next couple of weeks, find an AA meeting or a Celebrate Recovery meeting to go to. One of the persons that's taking the class for credit has emailed me and said that he wants me to go with him to one of those because he feels like where he works, if it was public knowledge that he went to one of those meetings, he could get in trouble. But if I were with him there, then he could say to the people that he works with, hey, I was with my pastor who was requiring me to go. And if that's the case for you, I'll be glad to go with you. I have no problem with people thinking I'm an alcoholic. I'm probably worse than that. So but I'd love for you to kind of find a place, and that would be the first assignment I'd like you to probably do. And what's really interesting is if you Google Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in Knoxville, Tennessee, you're going to see this litany of, and you go, gosh, I don't think I'll have time. Literally, there'll be one during your lunch hour within 10 miles of wherever you are. They're all over. If you know, it's almost like a code. Once you see the code, you always see them. Like, any of you ever gone on a cruise? There's that list on the cruise, and you'll see at like 6 a.m. there's a meeting that says Friends of Bill, and that's an AA meeting. And people who know that one of the founders was Bill Wilson, they will know that there's an AA meeting during the cruise, and they know the code. And so every morning there was an AA meeting in the ship that's pouring alcohol like water that they can go to get help. So they're all over the place. AA is secular, though it is spiritual. I mean, the first step is realizing that I'm powerless over this problem, and I need God to help me get through it. Now they say I need power stronger than myself to get through it. Celebrate Recovery is a Christian version of AA, where they name Jesus as that. But I would love for the next time we get together, for that to be what we have a conversation about. What was that like for you? What do you think about that? And just write up a 2-page reaction, and don't worry about grammar or even the style of writing like it says on here. Just write your reaction. And I'm not interested in a deep theological dive into, are there really 12 steps? More just what did it feel like for you to go to that? What do you notice that the church could learn from? What do you think was really would not be helpful for the church? Be aware of that Saturday morning for the Prepare and Rich. On the syllabus, it says the training's $100, but when I talked to them this week, they've reduced that to $70 for our class. So you can get the training for $70. You do need to be here that day for that. So,
Is that what, July the 21st?
yeah, or the 27th, I think. I'll look. And if you can't, then let me know, and we'll figure out a way to make it work. But
Vacations.
well, don't come back from vacation for this. But yeah, July 27th. But if you and if nobody can make it that day, then we'll change the day. But that's a pretty important thing. I think that's really helpful. I use that test. I use that test still, all the time.
So are we taking the test and then being trained in it? Is that how?
Yeah, well, you're going to be trained in the test. You'll be given. I'm going to show you the instrument. I'm going to show you how to sign people up to take it. I'm going to show you what you'll get. We'll go through the 25 pages that you'll get and say what each one of those things mean, and then I'll give you a model of how to give that information out to couples. And then you get a free usage of it because you signed up. And what I would suggest is you do that with your spouse, and then if you want, I'll go through it with you. I mean, if you say okay, I'll take the test, and then we'll do that at a separate time. Does that make sense? And those are the only two things you need to worry about for now.
So just a question, like, what do you recommend for the reading? Because like part of me wants to cheat and be like, oh, like I read this, but I did read it like years ago. Like I read Instruments in the Redeemer's Hands. I read To Be Told Already, and what else? And I read the Keller article, and but so like should I just read the other books I haven't read?
Yeah,
do you recommend that?
yeah, and I'll tell you what. I'll even actually give you an option to, if there's a book you want to read, ask me, and we'll put. I'm not into busy work. I'm not interested in you all taking a class and doing busy work. I really want you to feel like you were trained in counseling, and so, I'd rather you probably not. If you say, I don't remember much from that Redeemer's Hand book, I'm going to reread that. That'd be fine.
Well, that's why I wanted to read that one, and I want to read Crab's book, and then the Peter Scazzaro.
Yeah.
Those ones I wanted to read, but I'd already read the other ones, and I was going to just tell you, like, yeah, I read them.
Well, and I just think you would enjoy better to learn.
Okay.
And so the goal of this class is to learn, not to check boxes.
Yeah.
So I just want you to leave here with a
It's actually better than
with a real sense.
seminary so far has been like.
Well, listen. When I used to teach in seminary, I'd say this to the whole class: say, I hate busy work. I hated it when I was a student. I hated it as a professor because that means I have to grade it. And so I'd much rather do important things. And it's like people went, because there's sometimes a lot of busy work to this stuff.
Honestly, it was a relief when I found out that you were doing this. I was like, oh man, because honestly, we've only been taking one course, at BTS, just so far, and man, like my first week, I had to read 2 books, and each were like 300 pages.
Yeah, do they not realize I'm working? I've got children. I've got a, yeah.
Well, I just don't see what's the point. Like, I can't retain all that information, you know, and I had to write just like a one-page essay on each one. I'm like, that was a waste of time. Come on, you know. So anyway, I like this. I like
Yeah,
this.
yeah. This is how I kind of want to deal with it. Just a little bit different for us. And so, so for the class, that's basically it. The other things that we will do, the other things you will do that they won't. Now I'm going to make it optional. They're welcome to come. We'll do a lab day on a Saturday morning where you practice counseling, and I'll invite them, but I guess most probably won't come. I'm just guessing. And then I've got a biblical counselor. I mean, he's got the head of the ABCAB group, Jim Newhouser, Dr. Newhouser, and he's going to do a Saturday morning lecture for you all that I'm going to Zoom in, so that especially the guys that are going to be at Birmingham, Birmingham's pretty strict biblical counseling, and so it's kind of funny they're letting me teach the class. And so I wanted to make sure that you're prepared for the next classes. And so I've asked Jim Newhouser to do that. And he's written the books. I mean, he's one of the grand poobahs of biblical counseling, and a good guy. Anybody have any questions or thoughts?
You wanted an email or something to confirm, preparing Rich?
Yeah.
Interest?
So anything else that any needs or any concerns you might have?
The pay, how do we enroll? Do we just have to go to the website and enroll? Or how does that work?
Next time we meet, I'm going to try to get everybody that's meeting. I know John wants to take the class and he's been watching it. I know Matthew wants to take the class and he's been watching it. I need to get all of us in the same room, and then we'll send names and email addresses to Birmingham, and then they'll sign you up. And then I've already talked to the guy at RTS, Lanny Conley at RTS, and once you get the credit, once Birmingham puts it on the credit, then you just keep a copy of the syllabus. Lanny already has a copy of the syllabus, but and say that you want to request credit. It's being, it's held at Birmingham Theological Seminary, and there shouldn't be any problem at all.
Great.
Because this is essentially the class I taught there for 20 years. So they're a little mad at me because they wanted it to be taught out of RTS, and they would have made money, and they're losing money by it being out of Birmingham, but they weren't willing to give you all a discount. So, it's a difference of about $900. So, because Birmingham charges $100 a credit hour, so this class costs you $300. RTS charges $5.99 a credit hour, and so you do the math. Even though you're getting the third off because of the cohort thing, you'll still it's still much less to take it through Birmingham. So anything else?
No, quick question on the Celebrate Recovery. Is that something I could just go to their website and find out where they meet? Or
You can put Celebrate Recovery. I'll tell you where a couple. The easiest one is Shoreline. It's run by Henry Bieber, and I think it's Tuesday evenings. There's one in Lenore City that I've taken some people to on Thursday nights. There's and I often, just something is when you all are pastors, I often, if I suggest somebody to go to these things, it'll be helpful because you'll say, I've been to it before. I know what it's like. I know it's scary to go the first time. And I've gone the first time with many people. I mean, I've gone from our church. I mean, there's people in our church that were struggling with some addiction issues, and I went with them to Celebrate Recovery, and some of them are still going. You might bump into some of them there. There's probably 4 or 5 of them meeting. I know there's one in North Knoxville. they meet almost every weeknight somewhere in town, but Tuesday night is at Shoreline Church over on, is that Westland over there off of, yeah.
It's in three, it's a three-minute show. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And Cokesbury has one that's technically not a Celebrate Recovery, but it is. It started out as Celebrate Recovery. Celebrate Recovery requires some things that that a lot of people after a while don't want to keep doing, and so a lot of churches will just do their own program. Faith Promise has a program. What night is that? That's that you could go and get credit for going to there, but it's much much easier to find one than you think. I mean, if you say, listen, I've only got I've got an hour on Tuesday for lunch, and I'm going to be in this part, or I'm running my route here, or I'm doing this. You can probably find an AA meeting within a mile of that you go to, sit in, and when you go, if you go to one of these meetings, don't say I'm taking a class. Just go in and say I'm here, just checking things out. Nobody will get mad at you. Just say, my name's. In a true AA meeting, they'll go around the room and everybody will introduce themselves. They'll just give your first name, and so when I go, if I take somebody, I'll just say I'm Jim and I'm here to just check things out.
Well, when we go to those things, do they have you sign out a piece of paper with your phone number or anything like that? You just show up. Okay.
Just show now somebody. What you will see happen is if you go and you're kind of vague, like I'm Jim and I'm just checking things out. Usually at a real AA meeting, the whole meeting will change, and it'll become an evangelistic meeting because they'll go.
That's what I'm wondering about.
They'll think he's not willing to admit he's an alcoholic. Let's all talk about how we admitted we were alcoholics, and the group will often shift, and you just need to be uncomfortable for a few minutes and listen and be a part of it, and then when it's over, just be polite to people and then just leave. What you might find is that since addiction is ultimately idolatry, you might end up saying before you leave, I'm Jim and I'm an idol worshiper. But because I could, and my first, just to tell you a real quick story, my first experience with AA, I'm right out of college, couldn't find a job. And there was a detox center in town back then. This is like 1976, so 1980, called DRY, Detoxification Rehabilitation Institute. And that's where they sent the people that didn't have money. So if somebody on the street was picked up drunk and they said they wanted to sober up, they were sent to DRY. And they'd stay there for about 14 days. It didn't cost anything, but it was just, and so I'd spent, it was a great job. First time I've ever, do you know what DTs are? It's delirious tremors. It's when somebody who's an alcoholic will begin to hallucinate. And I remember a guy once telling me, get the dog out of this room or I'm going to kill you. And there's no dog. I mean, and I said, well, there's no dog. And he says, and I won't use his language, but he said, I'm not kidding. I don't want that dog in here. And I said, you show me the dog and I'll pick it up and get it out, because he was going to kill me. But I remember I would take, part of my job was to take the guys that were there to a AA meeting. So every week I'd sit, every day, it was a daily thing. Every day I worked, I would sit in an AA meeting with those guys, and when it came to me, I'd say, I'm Jim Coffield, I work at DRY, and I'm here for that reason. And there was such care in that room. And I was just a kid back then. I'm probably still feel insecure sometimes, but pretty insecure back then. And I remember thinking, I want to be able to say I'm an alcoholic, because they really loved each other so well. And I remember thinking, and how crazy as this is, I remember driving home one day going, I wish I could say tomorrow I was an alcoholic, because they really care for you if you are, And And so I've got some real respect for the program, and I've been to a lot of them. So but I just think you need to, if you're going to be a pastor, you can't advise somebody to go somewhere you haven't been. And so when they go, gosh, what's that meeting going to be like? And you say, well, I can tell you what it was like when I went. That'll change the conversation. So, any other questions? If you having trouble finding something, let me know. Give me a call, and
I
I'll.
guess one question, because I'm going to ask someone, and if I'm not allowed to do this, I won't do it. So like if I ask James, like, hey James, want to go to this one together? Can we go together? Or,
Yeah, just don't pal up so much that be a little bit vulnerable with it. Don't go with more than two. I mean, don't get like, hey, let's get everybody. Let's have 8 of us go and get T-shirts. It's in a way we really don't belong here. But just it might be good to just be a little uncomfortable, because the person you send there from the church someday, they'll be real uncomfortable.
I'm just not really good at pretending like and stuff like that, and I'm gonna mess it up.
You'll be fine. Just and if you look under AA, there will be some meetings they really won't care, but some of them will say open meetings, which would be the meeting you would, if you want to get picky, that would be a meeting you'd go to.
Okay.
But they wouldn't care if you go to any meeting. They just want people to sober up.
Maybe we can grab some beer and just put it on.
That's right. Just and you'll see a lot of smoking and a lot of coffee.
Okay.
They sometimes call that the 13th step, is to drink a lot of coffee and and do some smoking, because you'll find that to be pretty common at some of those places. Not at Celebrate Recovery, because they'll drink coffee, but there won't be the smoking. Anything else? Hey, I really do think the good news is that I think that this is going to end up fitting into Birmingham's Theological Seminary's schedule in such a way where our class won't finish on time, which means we will have until like December to turn the grades in. So that means you're going to have all there'll be plenty of time to do all the readings, to do all the assignments. I want them done. I want to take it seriously, but this should be. I really just want you to be better shepherds, and you can go to seminary and never be a shepherd, and so I don't want you to leave this class like, man, I got through that. That was horrible. I'd much rather you leave the class with a curiosity that says, I want to learn more. When I have time someday to do some more reading, I want more training. I want more reading about that. All right, guys, let's go home.